Thank you, young ladies. That was certainly beautiful, wasn't it? Nice to be here today, and welcome to everyone. Hope you enjoyed the worship today as we worship together. The service today is about letting God fight for you. So often we seem to have a battle. We make our own battles and we don't let God help us to fight them. The old man lay on his bed. He wasn't real interested in a lot of things. He would watch his favourite sport on television. Then he would just go back into a comatose sort of a state. So the family called in a medical expert to see if they could help with the old man. They couldn't find much wrong with him. He seemed okay. And the medical expert suggested that they shift the television set around. So the old man had to move this way and that way and sit up, whatever. So that's what they did. Anyway, it was this way and that way and this, but nothing much else was going on. So they put the television set down the hallway. And when the game came on and the music was blaring, the old man said, the game. Where's the television set? They said, the television set's down the hallway. And if you want to see it, you've got to sit up and have a look. So the old man, he struggled, he turned left and he turned right. He tried to sit up. I know how that old man felt. Anyway, he gradually got up and sat up and he watched his program. And so it was down there, over here, over there, but nothing was happening. So they decided to put the television set just down the hall on the left was the living room. They moved the set into there. And so when the game came on, they turned the volume up so the old man could hear it. The game, where's the television set so I can see it? And he turned left and right and back and sat up. And they said, the only way you're going to see that game is to sit up, get out of bed and wander down to where it is. So with the aid of his family, they helped him onto his feet and he struggled down the hall to watch the game. You know, I wonder, is it much different with us today? Are we spiritual invalids? Do we sit in our seats and if Brother X or Sister Y doesn't help us, or if God's not doing it for us, do we want to do anything for ourselves? I want you to turn to Scripture this morning and just see what God did in his fight for Israel. I want you to turn to Numbers 13. Numbers 13 and verses 1 to 3. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Send thou men that they may search the land of Canaan, which I give thee, the children of Israel. Of every tribe of their fathers shall ye send a man, every one a ruler among them. And verse 3 says, And Moses, by the commandment of the Lord, sent them from the wilderness of Paran. All these men were heads of the children of Israel. And just down in verse 16 to 20, and we find there that two great men, Joshua and Caleb, were chosen in that group. And these men, they went to spy out the land of Canaan. And as they were in the land, searching it out, and you can see in verse 23 it says, And they came under the brook of Eshcol, and cut down from thence a branch with one cluster of grapes. And if you read on there, it says, two men with a pole between their shoulders carted the bunch of grapes. That's how big they were in the land of Canaan. And verses 30 to 33, now we have the problems. And Caleb, they started whispering against Moses, and Caleb stilled the people before Moses and said, Let us go up at once and possess it, for we are able to overcome it. But the men that went up with him said, We be not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And they brought up an evil report of the land which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, The land through which we have gone to search is a land that eats up the inhabitants thereof, and all the people that we saw in it are men of great stature. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, as we were in their sight. Here we have the children of Israel bordering on the promised land, and here they were toing and froing. God says, go up, take hold of the land, go and inhabit it. But no, they didn't do what God said. They toed and froed, and they found excuses for not accepting what God had told them to do. And just in Numbers 14, 1 to 4, and all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried. The people wept that night, and all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron, and the whole congregation said unto them, Would God that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would God we had died in this wilderness? And wherefore hath the Lord brought us unto the land to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should be a prey? Were it not better for us to return unto Egypt? Then they wanted to make a captain to lead them back to Egypt. But just in verse 6 it says, And Joshua the son of Nun, and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, which were of them that searched the land, rent their clothes. And in verse 9, Only rebel not ye against the Lord, neither fear ye the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Joshua and Caleb are saying, we can eat them, no problem. We can handle this situation. But they doubted. And in verse 14, And they will tell it to the inhabitants of this land, for they have heard that the Lord art among his people, and that our Lord seem face to face, and that the cloud stands over them, and we know the pillar of fire leads them by night. So here they were on the border of the promised land. Just go and inherit it, God says. But they weren't prepared to let God fight their battles for them. They were worried about the giants. They were worried about all the problems in the land. God said, go and take it. That was literal Israel. Today, as spiritual Israel, I wonder, are we any different? We're on the borders of the promised land. Do we take hold of the promises that God gives to us today? Do we? Or do we to and fro, as did literal Israel? It just seems that so often we don't take God at his word. God will fight for us. God will win the battle. You know, sometimes it's good to have good advice, and the scriptures give us good advice. When I was a young man, only a late teenager, I purchased a piece of land, and I engaged a builder to build a house. And as the house progressed, I realised there was going to be a shortcoming of £1,000, $2,000. Doesn't seem much today, but in those days wages were 75 cents to $1 an hour, so $2,000 was quite a sum of money. So I fronted up to the bank manager, never having done before, and I told him what I was about, and he was an old man and very wise. He said, Leslie, I will give you the money for that house. I said, I've been past the house, I've seen how it's building, it's a good house. I'll give you the money. He said, but I want to give you some good advice as well. He said, when you come to the bank manager to ask for money, he said, you walk into the bank manager's office and you say, Mr. Bank Manager, I need 100,000, a million, whatever it is you want, and tell him what you want it for, and you expect him to help you with that loan. So I took the old man's advice, and over the next 60 years, I've been able to talk to bank managers, borrow money from $2,000 to almost $2 million, and never had a knockback from a bank manager ever, because I took the good advice. This book, this Bible, is full of good advice. The more I read this book, the more good advice I get. And the more I read each chapter, the more advice I get. Sometimes Most of us have read the scripture through several times. I've read it through quite a few times, but some of those chapters in the scriptures, there's just so much in them. The more we read, the more we study God's word, the greater will be our reward. You know, some of these old chapters, I've read them 30, 40, maybe 100 times. Each time, or most times, you can just find something that's a little bit different, something more out of the scriptures. You know, Joshua said in 24:15, "Choose you this day whom you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." So God fought for Israel. They didn't accept it. Now we find that God fought for Hezekiah. If you turn to 2 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Second Chronicles 32, 1 and 2. After these things and the establishment thereof, Sennacherib king of Assyria came and entered into Judah and encamped against the fenced cities and thought to win them for himself. And when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib was come and he was purposed to fight against Jerusalem, what did he do? We find that he went to God. Verses 5 to 8. Also he strengthened himself and built up the wall that was broken and raised it up for the towers, and another wall without, and repaired Milo and the city of David, and made darts and shields in abundance. And he set captains over them and in verse 7, "Be strong and courageous, be not afraid, nor dismayed of the king of Assyria, for all of the multitude that is with him. For those that are with us are more than those that are against us." And what a wonderful thing that is, to believe that those that are with us are more than those that are against us. It might seem sometimes you're all on your own. But friends, if God's on your side, who can be against you? No one. The arm of flesh cannot stand against God. Just a bit further in there, in verses 15 to 17 in the same chapter. "Now therefore let not Hezekiah deceive you." This is the king of Assyria talking now. "Let not Hezekiah deceive you, nor persuade you on this manner, neither yet believe. For no God of any nation or kingdom was able to deliver his people out of mine hand." So what an opportunity Hezekiah had here. No one had been able to be delivered from the hand of the Assyrians. But in this case, God did deliver them. And just in verse 20, it says, "And for this cause Hezekiah the king and the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amos, prayed and cried to heaven." And I won't go through it now, but if you want to just check, if you look at Isaiah, and it's in verse 37, 36 to 38, where God destroyed 185,000 people that were coming up against Hezekiah. Assyrians were coming up against Hezekiah. So God certainly fought for Hezekiah. You know, when we have sometimes our eyesight, we might be going blind slowly, and physical blindness will separate us from things and from people, but spiritual blindness separates us from God. And you know, so often as we have been doing something for so long, we think, we get weary in well-doing, and we think, you know, everybody's doing this and everybody's doing that. You know, friends, the world's full of everybody else. They're everywhere. Don't be tempted to follow everybody else. Also, God fought for Elisha. Now, if you turn with me to 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 8 to 18. I'll just read some of these. Then the king of Syria warred against Israel and took counsel with his servants, saying, in such and such a place shall be my camp. And the man of God, Elisha, told the people about it, so they didn't go where the Syrians were going to be. And the king of Assyria was so worried, he said, and we got all these men together, he said, who's against us? Who is fighting for Israel? Who's fighting for? And one of the generals said, when you speak in your bedchamber at night, Elisha is so in tune with God that he hears what you say. So that was the relationship that Elisha had with his God. And he knew what was going to happen. And just down there in, I think it's in verse, if I go from 15 on, and when the servant of the man of God, this is Elisha's servant, was risen early and gone forth, behold, a host encompassed the city with horses and chariots. So the king of Assyria had sent all these chariots and horsemen to capture Elisha. And the young man said, alas, my master, how shall we do? Here we are, all the enemies there, we're lost. But we find in verse 16, and he answered, fear not, for they that are with us are more than they that be with them. And that's the wonderful thing. Again, God fighting for the people. Those that are with the enemy, they're nothing. You have the best. And Elisha prayed and said, I pray thee, said the Lord, open this young man's eyes that he might see. And when his eyes were opened, when they came down to him, Elisha prayed unto the Lord and said, smite the people, I pray thee, with blindness. And so we know that once again, God fought for Elisha. He was able to overcome. And this young man, when he saw the chariots of fire round about, he was amazed what God had done. And so often we have the attitude of what we've done. You know, we think, oh, well, they wanted $5, I gave 10, and I good. Someone else preaches a Sabbath school lesson, thinks what a wonderful job they've done. Or we fed 3 hungry people this week. So often we seem to have the ideas about what we've done. And the minister might say, I've done 1,000 sermons. I've done 500 Bible studies. 20 people have been baptised. So what? You know, it's not what we've done for God, my friends. It's what God has done for us. And if we let him, he can do great things. The next illustration, and I've got more to go, but it's the last one, and it's about David. Now, in the last sermon I talked to you about 1 Samuel 16. That was when David was chosen as king by Samuel, and he was one of the 8 sons of Jesse. Now, I want to, this morning, look at 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel 17. First Samuel chapter 17 and verses 1 to 4. Now the Philistines gathered together the armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shochoh, which belonged to Judah, and pitched between Shochoh and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. As you go through this 1 Samuel 17, you find that one army was on the battlefield on this side of the hill. Israel was on this side. In between was a valley. And wherever there's a valley, there's always a watercourse in the bottom. Unless I don't know what Death Valley's like, but all other valleys, everywhere, if there's a valley, and there's always a stream in the bottom, because when it rains, the water runs down and the water runs through. We once owned a big property up near Nebo, and there was a hill on each side and one in the middle. We had two valleys. And when it rained, the heavy rain, those creeks would go from hill to hill with water right across. So anyway, we'll get on with our story about David. And verses 10 and 11 in 1 Samuel 17, and the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of that, and we said a while ago, son of Jesse. And he said when he came along, and he said, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Who is he that defies the armies of God? You know, we're able to defeat him. Here was the Israelite army, a trained army with Saul as their king, but they didn't have God fight for them. Goliath, the giant of Gath, for 40 days he came out against the people of Israel, and he said to them, send a man that I may fight with him. And you know, it shouldn't have been 40 days. The battle should have been over on the first day, because God was fighting for these people. And if they had have taken God at his word, Goliath would have only spoken once, and that would have been the end of him. But it didn't work that way. I just want you to look further in 1 Samuel 17 and 19 to 24. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley. 32 to 36. I already read that. 32 to 36. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight the Philistine. And Saul said to David, you're not able to go and fight him. He said, you're but a youth. He said, but the Goliath has been a fighting man since his youth. And just in verse 40, and he took his staff in his hand, and he chose him 5 smooth stones. And we know the story from there. David came up against Goliath, and Goliath said, Goliath was furious that a man like David would approach him. He said, I will kill you today. I'll feed your body to the birds and the animals. And David said, you come to me with a spear, with a sword and a shield. I come to you in the name of the God of heaven. And what an outlook on life. What a difference. You know, David said when the bear and the lion came into the flock and took a lamb, I run them down, I fought them, I grabbed him by the beard and I killed him. What a wonderful... And here's Goliath going to defy the God of David. You know, and we know the story how David killed Goliath. When Goliath hit the ground and fell face first onto the ground, you know, I took a few measurements this week. If I was flat on the ground there on my face, I won't tell you the vital statistics, but I know how big I'd be laying on the floor. But I estimated that Goliath, with his armour and the size of the man, he'd be anything from 90 plus centimetres deep. So he wasn't just a little lump on the ground. This was a big lump. God, he'd just about take up right across the stage and about that high. That's how it was when Goliath hit the ground. And what did David do? He ran and jumped upon so he had to be fairly accurate, to jump up on the carcass. That's as a vulture would jump on the carcass of a wild animal. David jumped on the carcass of Goliath, drew his sword, and like he told him he'd do, he took off his head. And then all the brave Israelite soldiers, all those that would not accept God's fight for them before, now they rallied round, and as the Philistines fled, they fled after them and killed them. What a tragedy. Why do we have to wait until someone else makes a move? Move for God, move for God. Now let God fight for you. And the wonderful thing about David and Jesus, David is the 28th times grandfather of Jesus. You go down through the generations, David's the 28th times grandfather of Jesus. So that's how much God and man is intertwined. We've been studying this quarter about God and about covenants. What a covenant God has with man. To allow David, the earthly king, to be 28 times grandfather of Jesus, the heavenly king. That's the mystery of godliness. Jesus died and was resurrected from the grave. And when he was, I believe that Satan worked with new vigour after the cross, because the fact that Jesus overcome the grave, overcome death, the serpent was wounded and was angry. When I was a small boy, I was growing up on a farm in Pig Island. I was 5-year-old, my brother was a 6-year-old, and I would go down to the stockyard and watch my father catch the draft horses. Boxer and Billy and Bawley, Prince and Captain, and the big Percheron horse, Silver. He's an evil horse. I'll tell you that another day. It's another story. Anyway, I would watch him catch the horses, put the winkers on. He'd put the collars on, hames across the collars, and the chains and the swingle bars and the harness. And he'd drive the horses up, put them in the plough, and he'd plough the field. And my brother and I would run along behind the plough, and we would catch mice and lizards and all sorts of things. And even the worms on that farm, of all the properties I've ever owned, I've never had a property, I've seen a property as rich as Pig Island. The big earthworms like that, and Dad would plough them out, and we'd pull them out of the soil. We loved those worms so much we even took them fishing with us sometimes. And as we were this particular Sunday morning, we were following along in the trench, and George and his wife Eileen and their small daughter and son Norman arrived for a visit. George was a station master up at the railway siding, 5 mile away or 8 kilometres away now. They came down in an old jalopy, it was an old T-model Ford, I forget what it was now, I was only 5-year-old. And it looked like a motorbike and sidecar on steroids, one of those sort of cars, Anyway, Norman was a sort of a blustering sort of a brute of a kid, and Storm and Norman certainly suited him. And when he came on the scene, he was all noise. He was like a bull camel. His mouth was open, his eyes were closed, and he was always yelling. And he was about 7 or 8, so he was older than us, and there was no sharing the run along the trench. He was first and most and best in everything. And so we had to follow along. As Dad was ploughing the paddock, he rolled out a big carpet snake, and I mean a big snake, not a little one, big snake, head like that. Anyway, as we're getting along and walking along the trench, and Norman was bellowing and performing, and the big snake saw us and he reared up like that, and after a while, bam, gotcha. The snake grabbed Norman by the shin. Well, it was funny before this, but now it was hilarious. All hell broke loose. He roared and he bellowed. My father was a fair way ahead with the horses by now, but even with the rattling of the plough and the squeaking of the harness and the rattling of the chains, he heard the performance, and he wooed the horses up, tied them up to the plough, and he ran back, put a headlock on Norman and pulled the snake off his shin. Now, there's a fair bit more to that story. If I haven't got time to tell you this morning, I'll tell you another day. Satan is waiting. He's the wounded serpent, and he's waiting to sink his fangs into our flesh. So often we just just take him too lightly. We don't have God fighting on our side. And if we do get stung by Satan, the only antidote we have is Jesus Christ. And it says in John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth on him should not perish, but have everlasting life." I just want to share a story this morning. It sort of reminded me in our Sabbath school lesson. There was a missionary went to the South Seas, and their boat was wrecked on the rocks, and only the missionary survived. His family and his helpers all died in the water. And the island people were hostile towards him. They said he could stay only if he didn't preach about his God. He was allowed to stay there. They looked after him and did everything for him. Several years after, another band of missionaries arrived at the island, and they were amazed at how friendly the Polynesian people were. They said when they started to talk, they listened and they accepted what was told, and they said, and they started to talk about Jesus. They said, "Yes, we know Jesus. Who told you about Jesus?" They said, "Jesus lived among us." He said he was shipwrecked here, we looked after him. He said, and when he died, we buried him up there on the hill. And you know, friends, those people accepted the new missionaries, all because of the man before acted like Jesus would act. You know, today, God is waiting to fight for you and for me. What a fellowship, what a joy divine, leaning on the everlasting arms. What a blessedness, what a peace is mine, leaning on the everlasting arms. Our last hymn this morning is hymn number 469.
Liz, while they're doing that, it reminds me of a story I read. A reporter asked Abraham Lincoln whether he thought God was on his side. Abraham Lincoln said, "That's not important whether God's on my side. What's important is whether I'm on God's side."
Yeah, that's true.